Hey all, so back with another Spotlight with Context, and today we are talking about Arnim Zola, or somewhat more accurately, the robot body playing host to the consciousness of Arnim Zola. He's a very weird character. But let's go ahead and get into it with the champion attributes. Survivability of 4. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. Generally, when you have a 5 out of 5 defender, jumping ahead to that one, their survivability or their damage kind of needs to be high, and Zola is definitely leaning more on the tank side of things. It is difficult to chunk through him quickly, and that gives him time to get his threats online, and they are significant. Damage of 3, he has a very fun playstyle on offense, but there are going to be things that mess with it, right? It's about chaining heavies together. That is vulnerable to stand your ground, but it's also kind of something you can only do in the corner. And so you're going to have to deal with the fact that in certain fights you just can't get the opponent to the corner, right? There are going to be things that mess with his absolutely ideal damage payout. And I think one of the biggest parts of playing him is accepting that those spikes, those high end payouts, are just not how he was tuned for everyday fights, right? When those happen, they're awesome. Enjoy them. But very often, this character is going to be more about a heavy cancel into a special 2, and that's going to do enough damage that his survivability and unique utility are worth it for you, right? And we'll cover more of that as we go. I think with everything I just said, ease of use being at 2.5 makes a lot of sense because yeah, it is tough to maximize the damage, but all of the utility is there and is pretty easy. A lot of it is even close to automatic. And so this character still has real value, even if you're not getting the absolute ceiling of DPS. Again, we talked about the utility. 3, I think, is fair because there's not an absurd amount of it, but it is pretty unique and very powerful. And we'll talk about that. Already alluded to the defender strength. He's really annoying to fight. So, strengths and weaknesses, getting into a bit more detail. Zola can lock special attacks for a long time. That is good, right? There are a lot of characters out there where you're particularly concerned about one of their special attacks and not the other. You know, special 3s being an exception. Zola's really good for those fights. He is very, very tanky, hence the hyper durability. And like it says here, his damage comes from disintegrations. No one is currently immune to disintegrate, and it's not subject to resistance because it deals direct damage. Disintegrations also have the benefit of reducing the opponent's combat power, so this is a very powerful damage type. Weaknesses. If you can hit Zola with a heavy attack frequently, it does a good job of shutting him down. It can be difficult to land a heavy attack on. We'll talk about that as we go. True damage is very effective at cutting through his armor, and it's one of the only things that cuts through his armor. We'll talk about that more too. And then big basics, right? Because Zola reduces the hit damage of the opponent's specials a lot using Cowardice, but Cowardice doesn't affect damaging effects applied by specials and doesn't affect basics. So those are still going to be your best weapons. So getting into the abilities, first up, Zola's a robot and so is immune to bleed and poison, has the robot tag, interacts with various robot things, but it's important to note that some of the most notable anti-robot effects, such as Nebula's ability accuracy reduction or the special bonuses in Medusa's and Arcus's Armor Shattered, are largely blocked out by this next line that Zola's ability accuracy and combat power rate can only be modified by his own effects. So, a robot, but a robot mostly with upside, and those immunities matter, right? Because we already talked about how damaging effects are an important way to get through Zola. Well, there's 2 damaging effects you can't use. Next up, the critical penetration of the opponent's basics is reduced by 80% flat. It is important to note that critical penetration, which is the amount of armor and resistance that critical hits ignore, is 80% by default. So an 80% flat reduction means that unless there's something else modifying critical penetration, crits just don't ignore Zola's armor, and his base armor is quite chunky. So you can't just rely on your big yellow numbers to be big, right? It's important to note the way this works is that you'll still get the critical damage rating bonus, right? Your yellow numbers will be larger than your non-yellow numbers. It's just that you won't also ignore the resistance. So it doesn't completely zero out critical hits like Man-Thing would, but it does mean that you're going to be doing a lot less damage, and you do have to think about that. On top of that, Zola cannot lose more than 10% of his max health from a single damage source other than a special 3, meaning that as you are dealing with that armor, as you are dealing with your crits being blunted, you also can't nuke him down with a single big burst of damage, similar to how future Ant-Man also has a damage cap, right? Last in this section, Zola's first medium and first light attacks do not make contact. This is your first little hint at why it's difficult to land heavy attacks against Zola, because if you can't parry non-contact, or you can't land a heavy outside of parrying, you're going to have some trouble regularly landing those heavy attacks. Zola's heavy is difficult, right? It is a very difficult counter. There are very few champions that can successfully heavy after it, and so don't rely on that just being something anyone can do as long as they can block well. You're going to need to actively find openings. Getting that out of the way now. Systems of control. Zola has a pre-fight ability that lets him pick either a special 1 or a special 2 lock, and whenever he finishes a special attack, he inflicts that lock as a passive for 20 seconds. So this means that if you spam any of your special attacks, right? As long as you throw one every 20 seconds, you can completely lock down an opponent's special 1 or their special 2. The most obvious impact of this is that Zola doesn't need Incinerate immunity to fight Bishop, right? Because that's often one of the biggest threats against Bishop is you try to avoid the special 1, push to the special 2 with someone who can't handle the Incinerates from the steady release on the special 1. Zola can just pick the special 1 lock and completely lock out Bishop's special 1 and push to special 2 easily every time. There are a lot of other applications of this ability. It's very good, but that's just going over one. If you don't pick either pre-fight, which honestly I did sometimes during playtesting just by accident, you do still get something as a consolation prize, which is that your opponent's special attacks get blunted by a 30% cowardice debuff. Now, often, I think if you're fighting somebody where you don't really care about either of their specials, it might still be better to pick the special 1 lock so that you have more runway to throw heavy chains. But if you don't, this cowardice debuff does matter, right? There are some mutant opponents who care about cowardice. This helps against them. And even if the opponent's abilities aren't listening for cowardice, reducing the hit damage of their specials by 30% and potentially getting another debuff towards inequity to reduce their attack rating by up to 6% is going to matter, right? Remember, Zola already has really good armor rating, and so that means he blocks well. You combine this on top of that, and if you're dealing with an opponent where their specials are nasty, you don't have the evades down, but you also feel like the special lock isn't going to necessarily help you get around that, you can do this and just blunt specials in general. And then as a defender, this just becomes a 90% cowardice passive, meaning that whenever you're fighting Zola, you have to deal with your specials dealing 90% less damage on their actual hits. Again, this does not affect red numbers, it does not affect basics, it's just the actual hit damage of the specials. Alright, our next section, ESP Box. When Zola is struck by anything other than a heavy attack, he gains an indefinite ESP charge, and when he blocks a hit, he gains 3. These stack up to 30 like it says, but the important threshold is 20, because as soon as Zola gets to 20, Then before being hit by a basic, he has a 10% chance to consume all charges and inflict a sleep passive for 3 seconds. As a reminder, sleep is instantly removed when that character is struck, which can be pretty important for an attacking Zola because it means that if you use your medium to close the distance and then try and charge a heavy, well, surprise, they're not asleep anymore. So this does mean you have to pay attention to spacing and often allow yourself to walk forward a little bit and then start your heavy chain. But just want to call out that wrinkle because it can get in the way. If you're fighting a defending Zola, then it's important to note nobody is immune to sleep. And so this is a real threat. Like I just said, when sleep ends, which is as soon as struck, there are some characters who will be able to deal with that, right? Like maybe you have a way to get an evade online, or a miss, or an unstoppable, which means that the sleep only is a single hit. All of those are ways to mitigate this threat, but it is significant. And then for each charge over 20, that chance is increased by 5% flat, which means that at 30 charges, you're looking at a 60% chance. You just cannot combo into Zola. And it means that if you are attacking with Zola and your opponent combos into you, the higher those charges get, the more likely you are to just inflict the sleep. Now, it is important to note that because this happens before the hit lands, this can happen when an opponent is hitting into your block with basics, even if that's not what you want. You kind of have to be ready for that, right? Be aware that it can happen and be ready to capitalize on that sleep with a heavy. However, you can also predict things because if you're doing a well-timed block, then the chance for the sleep is increased to 100%. You stop the hit before it lands, inflict the sleep. It doesn't even matter if they were unblockable, and then you can go to town, right? If Zola's knocked down by a heavy attack, he loses 10 ESP charges, and this is particularly important on defense. This is why we said you want to find openings for heavies. Because you want to keep him below 20 charges, because the second he gets to 20, he has the chance of inflicting that sleep. And the only way to keep him below 20 is to regularly throw heavies, right? You also want to, as much as possible, just not hit a defending Zola's block at all, because he'll ramp faster that way. But yeah, be looking for ways to land your heavies, because if there's not boosted spirit gain, you're probably not going to be able to rely on your striker for frequent enough heavies. And so for most characters, some kind of stun, whether it's the America Chavez, Gladiator, Deathless Thanos heavy charge, or just a stun on some other trigger, or the ability to parry non-contact are going to be very helpful for you. If you're fighting Zola on a stun immune node, then it's gonna get harder. There are still tools. Like I said earlier, you can find openings with miss, with evade, with unstoppable. Like counterpunch is one way to do this, right? So Killmonger or Deathless Thanos can find ways to land this heavy even with stun immunity, but it's going to be harder and you're probably going to take some damage, so calling out that threat ahead of time. Next up, Disintegration Gauntlets. We've mentioned the heavies a few times as being important. This is why. The first hit of the heavy attack inflicts a disintegration debuff for 0.5 seconds. It's also only a 0.5 potency disintegration debuff. As a reminder, the listed percentage potency of disintegration is how much it reduces combat power, right? So every 2 of these debuffs reduces combat power by 1%. And you can get a lot of these. There's no cap listed, meaning they go up to 99. That's the default in this game. So if you have 99 disintegration debuffs up, you're reducing how much power your opponent is getting from being struck by almost 50%. Now, as a reminder, most opponents that you run into will actually have a combat power rate of 120, so that's not a full half reduction. It's 120 down to just over 70, but that's still really, really potent, right? If the opponent is not stunned, then inflict 5 additional debuffs, so you immediately start with 6 and that 3% combat power rate reduction. While the opponent is suffering from any of these, all of Zola's hits inflict another one. And there are a lot of hits in his heavy, so right away you get a bunch that way. And then crucially, these disintegration debuffs are paused while Zola is charging or performing a heavier special attack, and the final hit of his specials removes them. So this means that if you chain multiple heavies together and then eventually cancel one into a special attack, you hold on to all of these disintegration debuffs. And every half second that you keep them paused is effectively dealing their full damage again, right? It's very like Prowler in that sense. Same designer. Because that listed damage of 116 is calculated over that 0.5 seconds, if you pause them for another 0.5 seconds and get another damage tick, it's going to be that full 116. And so if you can get these paused for 10 seconds, you're dealing 20 times the base damage. So these can get away from you quickly, right? And if you're keeping them paused, it means you're launching heavies or specials, which means you're applying more. Now, it is important to note that Zola does not have a built-in way to get around Stand Your Ground. That would be too strong. I really don't want to see comments on this video about how that wouldn't be too strong. Just, it wouldn't break the game. Why not let him do it? Because it would. So don't. But he also does not pause these during strikers, so you really do have to find places to land heavies and specials. It's doable, and like I said at the top here, even if you can only land a single heavy counter and cancel that into a special attack, it's going to feel pretty good. So don't worry too much about the ceilings you're going to see on YouTube fights, but when you can find them, like I said, it's very fun. So, Special 1, this gives you a very long 10% energized passive. You can stack up to 5 of these. Means you can throw a lot of Special 1s, right? And that's going to mean that each of these specials just gets faster and faster and faster. And then eventually you're going to very easily get to your Special 2. The dev notes call this out. If you are trying to make sure you always have your special lockup, the Special 1 is your friend because that energize makes it easier. Additionally, this does ramp Zola a bit by giving him that Fury buff. It's pretty difficult to hold on to more than 2 of these at a time. But if you play your cards right, you can have those 2 4-second Furies up for a Special 2, thanks to having 5 energizes. I don't think you need to chase that. Most of the time this is just going to be, okay, I have a Fury buff from the Special 1 that's paused until my next special attack, so it's definitely going to be there for my Special 2. And when I'm chaining Special 1s, I often have 2 of these Furies. That's the important part to hold on to. That's going to feel good. Special 2 is intended as the cash out on offense and the big threat on defense, right? Because this big disintegration passive is on activation. It's inflicted right as the special attack starts. It doesn't need to land to do this. It's a passive, so you can't purify it. It's 40%, so it's really going to hurt your combat power rate. And it's going to deal a little bit of damage over 10 seconds, but that damage is going to be worse if there's a Fury active, right? You are definitely going to feel this as chip damage. Additionally, each buzzsaw hit in this attack consumes one of Zola's personal energizes to inflict a 10% disintegration passive, dealing more damage over 10 seconds, right? So you get the 40% disintegration passive, you can get up to 5 more 10% disintegrations if you've ramped enough. That means that you have a 90% combat power rate reduction for 10 seconds. Plus, if you cancel this special attack out of a heavy, you probably have some other disintegrations. Again, most opponents have 120% combat power rate, so you have to get to 120 to actually shut things down. But that is technically possible, at least for a little bit, if you chain enough heavies into a Special 2, because 90% from these disintegration passives, you would only need 30% from your disintegration debuffs, and that means you need 60 of them. It's a lot, but it's not strictly impossible, especially because we haven't talked yet about the fact that this character can benefit from Mr. Fantastic's pre-fights, can benefit from collar tech. Both of these things bring that ceiling you need to hit down, and it does mean that Zola, also apologize if I've said Zemo before, I'm not going to try and edit and replace every one of them. I'm just going to mess it up a certain amount. 2 Z names, same designer. It's messing with all of us. But that brings down how many of those disintegration debuffs you need to get access to, and it means that Zola has the ability to grant the opponent very, very little power as things get going. It's also worth noting the Special 2 just has a lot of hits, and so if you're canceling it out of a heavy, it's going to apply a lot of little disintegrations, which are going to stay paused through the whole special. Special 3, Zola inflicts an armor break debuff for 20 seconds, stacks up to 5, and gains a self-repair passive, healing 100% of his missing health over 20 seconds. This one's non-stacking. And that sounds really cracked, and the armor break's max stacks may look a little bit weird to you because it's going to be really hard to throw that many special 3s in 20 seconds, except for this last bullet. Each time this special attack is used, the next time you use it, those durations are tripled. This only happens 3 times because exponents get ugly. But this means that the second time you use this special attack, the armor break is 60 seconds. The self-repair passive is 60 seconds. The third time you use this, it's 180 seconds. And so that means that the self-repair passive gets weaker each time, because note it says base duration, right? It's telling you that that 100% of his missing health is actually stretched out over that total amount of time. And 180 seconds is a long time to dance to really capitalize on that healing, so you're probably not going to really benefit from much more than 2 uses of this there. But the armor break also gets longer, making it easier to stack, making it easier for you to do more damage because you'll have multiple armor breaks up. I really like that design decision. I think it's a cool little bit where the first time you use it, it's incredible for healing. The more times you use it, the worse it is at that, but you get better at damage. Very neat. In the signature ability, Zola gains the Psychic Shielding tag. This won't show up on the info page, but it does take effect in fight, meaning that anybody who has a call out for Psychic Shielding will listen for this, right? Emma won't activate her reverse controls, Strife won't activate his invisibility. I am, however, going to underline in big, bold letters that Psychic Shielding is not the same thing as immunity to reverse controls. Apologies from the team, in retrospect, for putting that stipulation on Emma's reverse controls, because she was the most notable and first use of it, and that has confused people for years since. But it's not immunity to reverse controls. It's not ever going to become immunity to reverse controls. And so don't take Zola into a fight expecting him to have immunity to reverse controls. Unless it's Emma or the Delirium node, right? Those are specifics. Those are exceptions. That's not the rule. Anyway, striking a sleeping opponent with a duped Zola gives you up to 12 seconds of passive unblockable. Now there's your stand your ground counter, right? This does require you to have charged up the sleep. There is a cost to it. It's interactable because the unblockable can be prevented by something like fear. But there you go. If you earn it, you do have a way to get past stand your ground with Zola, and that does make fights feel better. And then lastly, just pure damage. When Zola's special attacks remove his disintegration debuffs, each of those debuffs detonates for a final burst of direct damage, and that is basically giving you 2 more ticks, right? That's double their base potency. It's kind of like adding another second of pause to all of your disintegrations, except you get it in one big red burst. Very fun. Moving on to Synergies. First up, we have our obligatory Hydra one. 2 more shall take its place with a bunch of Hydra characters and one sometimes Hydra character. All of these champions start the fight with a Lying in Hate passive. That's a pun. Increasing attack rating by 10%, and then when struck by a special 1 or 2, it grants an indestructible passive for the remainder of that special attack. So you can tank a single special attack, but when you do, you lose your attack rating bonus. That's the trade-off. For Captain America specifically, while he's in fight, he counts as Hydra and a villain instead of a hero, which allows him to use the Lying in Hate passive. So there you go. Zima and Zola, because Kabam Sate likes messing with all of us. If I was working in office during this process, I would have brought in a jar and put $1 in it every time I said Zemo instead of Zola. It happens so much. But obviously this synergy is with Zemo. For Zola, when an opponent is immune to a stun effect, you gain extra ESP charges, so you can ramp really quickly and get that sleep up a lot against stun-immune opponents. And then for Zemo, if he runs out of cleanses during an opponent's special attack, his root is inflicted at the end of the special attack, making that a lot easier to use in certain high debuff fights. For Captain America Infinity War specifically, Zola starts each fight with an armor up buff. There's your Havoc counter, has a number of other nice little benefits, and just generally makes him even tankier, because remember, he cancels out the opponent's critical penetration, so that armor really matters. And then for Cap Infinity War, signature ability debuffs have a 100% chance to be inflicted an additional time, reduced by 25% flat for each instance of this debuff already present. So this isn't just doubling all of your SIG ability debuffs, but it's going to for sure double the first one, potentially double the second one, maybe double the third one, and that's going to allow you to keep much higher stat counts of those debuffs up at pretty much all times. This is going to make the Petrify in particular a lot more potent, because it makes it easier for Cap to have uptime on over 100% Petrify, and thus to reverse power gain and healing. It's going to let you stack a lot more armor breaks and deal way more damage that way. It's going to make the opponent hit for a lot less by inflicting all of those weaknesses, right? This is a really, really strong synergy. And then glued to the tube with Mojo, the first time in each fight that Zola is struck by a heavy, he gains a brace buff until the end of the attack. Because this is still a new effect, it spells out, brace causes champions to be passively unstoppable against the final hit of an incoming Special 1, Special 2, or Heavy. This is basically the Doom thing, right? It allows you to resist one heavy attack in the fight, and then punish it. For Mojo, for every 1,000,000 followers, Mojo passively regenerates 10% of the damage taken from blocked hits. Mojo has terrible block proficiency, but does have missing health regen, which generally helps him be tanky. This just makes him that much better at that, because it also gives him an answer to block damage. Really nice synergy for Mojo on offense. Geneticists with Mr. Sinister. For Zola, personal disintegration debuffs deal 20% more damage. That's most of your damage, so that is close to you deal 20% more damage. That's insane. And then for Mr. Sinister, personal degen debuffs deal 20% less damage, but last 50% longer. So they're still going to do more damage total, but it's also going to be significantly easier to get more pauses in before they expire, meaning it's probably going to be even more damage than it looks like on paper. Again, very strong synergy. And that's Zola. Hopefully I mostly said Zola and not Zemo. As of me saying this, I haven't gone back and edited it yet, so I don't know quite how bad it was, but ugh. Anyway. Really fun character, really interesting, quirky, is doing new things, very annoying defender. I'm not going to hide that. This is for sure a character you're going to have to worry about on defense. This is a character that is going to inform your rank ups, right? I'm not going to hide any of that. So pay attention to the threats, work on understanding them. But I also, like I've said a few times, I just think this is a fun attacker with a lot of really nice utility and sustain. I don't expect Zola to be winning any Battlegrounds races. This is not a Battlegrounds attacker. In Battlegrounds, you're just going to put him on defense. Let's not even pretend that there's a big deal about that. He's a defender. But in other game modes, there's real utility to a lot of this stuff. And I think anyone willing to put in the time and get used to his, frankly, a little bit odd rotation is going to be richly rewarded. So let me know in the comments how you're feeling about this one. We'll chat. And until next time, thanks so much for watching, and take care.